Welcome to the Fish North Georgia podcast, where we talk everything fishing here in North Georgia.
Make a cast over that brush pile and bring wolf packs of spotted bass up.
Georgia is blessed with so many of these electric-only lakes.
No, I didn't say that, Danny. Don't be
all
speculating
right,
now.
Okay, guys, today we got a treat for you. We've got an actual fish biologist. Is that the correct terminology?
Yeah, fisheries biology.
Fishery biology. This is Shan O'Gorman, and we grew up together. Haven't seen him in a long time. We've kind of reunited here lately, and I thought he would be able to bring some absolute great information from you guys. So real quick, why don't you kind of tell me and everybody listening a little bit about your education and what you do, and we'll go from there.
Okay. Well, I got a degree in fisheries biology from Georgia. And for people who don't know that term, it's basically like a marine biologist, but we study the freshwater fish.
Okay.
Marine biologists study saltwater fish predominantly. It's
Right.
not that we didn't study any saltwater fish. We did a few. And it's not that they don't study some fresh, but they separate them.
Gotcha.
And upon graduation, I started my own business, managing lakes throughout the Southeast. And I've been doing that since the 90s, since 97 when I started.
Okay, so when you say managing a lake,
Yeah.
describe that.
Okay, let's say you have a lake in your backyard.
And we're talking pond, 100
An acre to
acres.
1,000 acres.
Okay, right.
Once it gets past about 50 acres, it's considered a lake.
Okay.
Under that's considered a pond. But, I've stocked fish. I've controlled aquatic weeds. We do this thing called electrofishing surveys. It's basically like a fish taser. Stuns the fish so we can sample them, weigh them, measure them, and make a determination of the balance of the fishery, based on their weight and relative abundance. Water quality testing. Done a lot of that.
Most of these are they existing lakes, or have you ever took one from the beginning and?
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Actually, I wish a lot of my clients would just drain and restock their lakes. It'd be a lot easier. In fact, if everybody would just drain and restock their ponds about every 8 or 10 years, they wouldn't even need me.
Oh, really? And why is that?
It just keeps the balance there. What happens usually is people catch and release everything, and they don't have any competing fish like crappie in their pond. So the bass tend to crowd, and it's about 90% of the problems you see with lakes is bass heavy problems. They actually have too many bass. And in that scenario, since there are too many, there's not enough food to go around to each individual fish, and their growth slows and sometimes stops. It's not much different than cows on a pasture. You can't have as many cows as you can't go buy 10 acres and put 10,000 cows out there. It doesn't work that way. And that's how people are trying to manage their bass fisheries these days. Their pond can only hold so many fish. So if it has too many, their weights are going to suffer.
Okay, so your job basically is to come in and try to give the balance, the perfect scenario, bass, bait fish, catfish, I assume.
Exactly, sure, yeah.
Catfish for controlling the bottom or for bait? I mean, how do you?
Catfish, actually, you can have or not have catfish in a small lake. They will, once you put them on a feeder, and they'll go to 5, 6, 7 pounds in about a year on feed because they readily take the feed. They will start competing with your bass. So if you want a trophy bass fishery, I wouldn't recommend adding catfish. Just stick with the bass.
What do you think is a perfect size if you were going to build a trophy bass lake for a client? What's the perfect size pond or lake?
That's a good question. I've seen Great Lakes that are under 10 acres, and I've seen. That's a tough question.
Well, what makes a great lake? How about that?
Balance.
Okay, balance of what?
The fisheries balance. Without the proper balance, your fish can't grow. Let's go back. We talked about our bass being slightly heavy or slightly light. In a balanced fishery, you're going to have bass of all different sizes. That's the number one thing I'm looking for when I'm running my shock boat. I'm looking for 1 pounders, 2 pounders, up to 7, 8, 9 pounders. 10 pounders, great. I don't really care if I see a big kicker fish like that, because once they get to about 4 pounds and their mouth is about that wide, they can eat just about anything they want in the lake. Mm-hmm. And you usually don't see bass that are over 16 inches long that are underweight because they can eat other bass. They can eat anything they want.
So it's once they get to that level.
It's that 12 to 16 inch slot limit that I usually end up literally doing that, putting a slot limit on the fish. If you catch a fish between 12 and 15, it comes out. If you catch a fish over 16, it goes back.
And these are on lakes that you run. That's your recommendation.
If it's bass heavy. Now, on the flip side of that coin, say you have a problem, you have a competing species problem. Crappie is the number one problem with competing species in small lakes. And the reason why is crappie spawn earlier in the spring. So early, in fact, that their babies, their fry, have an opportunity like a month and a half, 6 weeks, 7, 8 weeks sometimes ahead of the bass. So all those crappie fry are in the grass, in the rocks, in the edges, and they're growing before the bass ever are born. Then you have your bass hatch. And they go up in there, and they're going right up in there with the crappie. All those larval fish are going to do the same thing. They're going to go right to the shallow water, right to the edge. But at that point, the crappie fry are big enough to eat the bass fry. And you can literally have a lakes under 50 acres where you have no bass in them anymore because of a crappie population.
Because of crappie. So your recommendation for those of us that like crappie, like to eat them?
Eat them, keep them, catch. If you can't keep too many crappie.
That's good. That's good. I like that advice because that gives me permission.
Yeah.
Now, so basically, you've taken your degree and you have put it in use, managing ponds, designing ponds. I imagine, like you put the structure in. If somebody wants a trophy lake, what kind of structure do you put in? And I assume this is for largemouth bass, not spots.
Yeah, we don't mess with spots too much in small impoundments. They don't do good. They need the rocks. Okay. They need the rock cliffs. They need 30 feet of water. They're just kind of a big open water reservoir type of bass. They don't do great in smaller impoundments. So I don't really manage for them. Anytime someone transports them over, they usually lose weight, and they'll live their life out there. They're not going to die in there, but they're not going to spawn. They're not going to become a...
So it's not, their potential will not be reached in a smaller lake.
No. So yeah, we definitely manage for the large mouse.
Okay. And what kind of structure are we talking in a lake you design?
I don't care, man. I was on a shocking job once, and this neighborhood homeowner association, they decided they didn't want anything in the lake. Nothing. They went and took out all the sticks. They took out all the rocks. It was like a cereal bowl. And it was only a couple of acres, but they didn't have any structure. If there was a blowdown, they pulled it out. They just wanted a nice, clean pond. And when I was running around, I was having a hard time locating the fish because there was no structure to shock around.
Right.
I came across one of those little yellow shovels that the kids use at the beach to dig in the sand. It was just floating on the water. And a shocking boat has a pedal that you step on from the back. It completes the circuit. So if I see a dog or a kid or something happens coming near the boat, I can let up on the pedal and it stops the electricity. So I let up on the pedal and I got close to the shovel, the yellow shovel, kind of as a joke, and I stepped on it. That's a good way to get your field really close to the structure. You let up on it and you move up to a tree or rocks or whatever. You step on it and it hit it. And there was like 30 bass sitting up under that yellow shovel.
Under that shovel.
Mm-hmm.
Just relating to it. That's all it is.
Because there was nothing else for them to relate to.
Really? Mm-hmm. And I guess that's just innate in the bass structure.
It is.
You got to be there.
They use it. They use good structure. It's like a convenience store for them. It makes it easier for them to eat. And if I'd say one thing to a fisherman about structure is watch the shadows. The bass especially use the shadows. It gives them an advantage visually, and you can see it in everyday life. Go stand in the shade and let somebody stand in the sun. You can see them easily, but they can't see you easily. And that's what bass do. They get inside underneath things and use that shadow so they can get closer so they can catch their food.
To ambush.
Mm-hmm. It's an ambush. It's a visual advantage.
Describe the shocking.
The shocking. Well, we use the boat is aluminum, which most people think is crazy.
Yeah, well, I was going to say that.
The boat it's basically no different than a welder, kind of controlled chaos, if you will.
Right.
You have wires that hang in the front. The boat is actually the ground. You get your electricity from a generator, and you have a shock box, which is not much different than a welder. And the positive is the wires in the water, and the negative is the boat. So as long as you don't put your hand in, you use an insulated fiberglass dip net, you can collect the fish as they come into the field. They'll get stunned like a taser. And that's how it works.
How many volts we talking?
Oh, we use 5,000. My old boat has a 5,000 watt generator, and it won't quite use all of it. So you're probably looking at 3,000 or so watts. But it also depends on the water quality. Say muddy water is way more conductive than clear water.
Okay.
So I can turn the box way down. What I'm looking for is amps. So if I can get 2,500 watts on about 2-3 amps of current, I'm going to be really turning fish up.
And
really well.
How long does it stun the fish?
The fish just lose their ability to control their muscles. So if he's swimming, he'll keep swimming, but he'll swim kind of crazy.
Right.
Like those videos you see on YouTube of guys getting hit with tasers.
Makes sense.
Same thing.
Okay.
Sometimes they lay there, sometimes they have a fit.
I want to ask you this question. Do you remember the old-fashioned telephone crank?
Sure do.
Now, my grandfather had one of those. I know they're slightly illegal, and God rest his soul, he's not around anymore, so I don't know where that thing's at. How did that work? Because I always heard you had to have a sandy bottom or something
Well,
like that.
you had to have a lot of special techniques there. That little phone didn't put out enough, and generally all they would get is catfish with that.
Okay.
Scaled fish are harder to shock up because that scales are like armor. But a catfish doesn't have the scales, and they're real susceptible to the electricity. So, yeah, with those old phones, and even a trolling motor battery, you can do 2 wires and short it right and get enough electricity to shock up a catfish with it.
Really?
Uh-huh.
Just old-fashioned ingenuity is
Tickling them
what I call
up.
that. Tickling them up. So you experienced when you do this electric, you're doing surveys. So you're taking the population and kind of judging and seeing what you need to do by what is coming up.
Basically, what you're going to end up with is 3 different ideas. Like you're going to narrow your field down to it's a balanced fishery and the fish look good, which is basically I'm catching fish of all sizes. I'm catching bluegill and bass, at least 2 different species of fish, they're reproducing. And I want to see them healthy. I want to see them above the relative weight that we've been talking about. And I want to see them all different sizes. And as long as you've got that, you're in good shape. You don't really need to play the catch and release game or the harvest game. You can let it go or not. It's up to you. If you have a small lake, I'd probably recommend you always keep about 10 pounds of bass per acre per year, just because they have a tendency to go to bass heavy. If you get in the habit of keeping a few, it's just easier for you. Don't let it get so far out of control. If you have crappie in your pond, you can't practice catch and release like that. You kind of have to always put them back because the crappie are always going to be competing with your bass that way.
Right.
So the crappie can really cause you some problems that way, and you can't. Some years you'll need to be keeping some bass, and some years you'll need to always be throwing them back with the crappie in there.
So it can change annually.
It can. It just depends on the weather, the reproductive cycles, and lots of different things.
What's the biggest fish you've ever shocked up?
Bass or fish?
Well, let's start with bass. What's the biggest bass you've ever shocked up?
I've had 2 10-pound fish, one in each hand.
One in each hand. Mm-hmm. South Georgia, North Georgia?
North Carolina.
North Carolina.
Mm-hmm. It was about a 70-acre lake. It was what I would consider, we'll call bass light.
Mm-hmm.
Not a heavy bass population, but when you see the shock survey, what you're going to see in that lake is you're going to see crappie, you're going to see gizzard shad, you're going to see threadfin shad, warmouth, bluegill, gar, carp. You're going to see a bunch of different fish species in there and a few bass. But the bass that are there have plenty to eat. And
they're big.
They get big.
Okay, what's the biggest fish you've ever shocked?
I saw a sturgeon one time bigger than the boat we were in. It was 15 feet long.
And that was where?
That was in the Savannah River.
Savannah River.
I got a great story about the Savannah River, as a matter of fact. I was doing a job. This wasn't for a fish management. This was for contaminants. We were testing the fish for metals. So you had to catch the fish and send them to a lab to get them tested. I don't even remember what we were testing for. It was, I don't know, mercury or something. I can't remember.
Right.
So we had 3 areas that we had to sample the fish from. Above the plant, at the plant where the discharge was. I think it was a paper mill. was either a paper mill or a power company. I can't even remember what it was.
So, but a warm water discharge.
Yeah, they had a warm water discharge. They used to cool the facility for whatever reason, right. and the state makes those guys test those fish, make sure they're not contaminating them, and that's what we were doing. The problem was the lower one back behind, because the EPD, the EPA, EPD guys tell you the size fish you need to catch, the species of fish you need to catch, and the locations you need to catch them, and we had to go do that. And we got down to the last one down there, and we turned the shock boat on, and the first thing that went by was a stingray. The second thing that went by was a tarpon.
Up the Savannah River.
Down the Savannah
River.
Down the Savannah River. Yeah, we were about 20 miles from the coast at that point, so we were getting really close to the salt. And that's bad for shock boats because it's so conductive, the electricity doesn't work anymore.
I get where you're going.
So if you can't get them with the shocking boat, you have to get the nets out. And you don't want to get the nets out, man. 150-foot gill nets, that's work. So I'm praying, please. We got 2 weeks to find like a dozen bass between, I think, 12 and 14 inches, or 12 and 15 inches. They had to be in a slot too, you know.
Right.
And we're looking at saltwater fish. I'm like, we're going to be down here forever. And we bid our time 2 weeks. It'll take us 2 weeks to do the job. So we're getting paid for 2 weeks. If it takes us 2 months, then
so be it. You get paid 2 weeks.
It took us 2 minutes.
Oh, really?
Yeah. We went down and weren't finding anything for a couple of hours, and there was a blowdown, a big one, a big tree, a 200-year-old oak tree in the water that had been washed in somehow. And I looked back at my friend and I said, hey, there's a big blowdown, kill the power. Let's get up on it, step on the pedal and see what happens up there. As soon as we stepped on that pedal, it was all largemouth bass on that tree. And they were all probably 12 to 20 inches long. And I'm talking like, I don't know, man, it went from no fish to all the bass we needed in 30 seconds.
But in salt water?
It was right there in that brackish water. And there was tarpon and redfish, but they were all just piled up on that blowdown, and we got every fish we needed right then. And we got 2 weeks worth of work done in about 2 minutes.
Well, that's good, and it's lucky for you. Yeah. But I'm really curious as to how a fish can be in that type of mixture of a water.
Oh, the bass can handle that salt. Yeah,
really?
Yeah, it wasn't too salty for them, obviously. They wouldn't have been there.
And tarpon and stingrays can go into fresh water.
Mm-hmm. Sure can.
And doesn't mess with them. They just...
Yep. They have the ability to deal with that as well. And they're not going to run way up into the pure fresh, and the bass obviously aren't going to run way down into the pure salt. But you got a good, mixture there of the fresh and the salt. They can definitely interact in there. The interesting side note to that story, though, is I think it's about 3 years later, we got the same job again, and we bid it the same, and we went down there and found that tree, and it happened again. So all those bass were right there on that tree 3 years later.
So what you're saying is bass relate to structure?
Bass relate a lot to structure. One of the we talked about Berkeley Lake earlier. One of the things I used to do at Berkeley Lake when I managed it, there's a good population of fishermen at that lake. And sometimes in the lake management business, you don't have fishermen at your lakes, which seems strange to guys like us.
It does.
But there's a lot of lakes that I managed that people didn't care about the fish. They just didn't fish. But that Berkeley Lake in Duluth there was a lot of fishermen at that place. So what I would do is I would say, all right, guys, let's go down the dam. You guys fish down the dam, all the riprap, and then into a cove, blowdowns, docks, that kind of thing. Fish it all back over here. Maybe 10 boats. Go fish those blowdowns over there, wherever. Just stay right around in here. And they'd all go fish. And then I'd put the shocking boat in behind them and show them what was there. And they would always be amazed that you could go get 20, 30, 40 bass out from behind them after everybody fished around through there and couldn't catch anything. The fish are there. They're always there. They're just not biting. Mm-hmm.
So basically what you're saying is we're going over fish left and right without knowing that they're there.
I would say this to anybody. If you know a lake, especially if you've caught a big fish in a spot, remember that spot, because I used to do that a lot. I'd put my shock boat in, and I'd go around a lake that I'd shocked before, and there'd be a stump, a ditch, I don't know, who cares, whatever, XYZ structure there, I could call it. Like, get ready, there's a big fish coming, and it would come. Because they orient to that structure all the time. They're always there. They're always going to use it. They're always going to take advantage of it. Year after year after year, they'll be there.
And so what you're saying is once one is pulled out, another one's going to take its spot.
I always make that note on my map. I caught this 8-pounder or this 5-pounder here, because that's the spot that's going to hold big fish.
And there's just something there that drew a big fish there, and it's just going to draw another one.
Yep, they'll always be there. They'll always move in and off that spot.
Okay, that's interesting information to have right there. But it makes sense.
Yeah, work the places that you've caught fish really hard, because they're there.
All right, so now that we've established that you have some knowledge into fish behavior, that you've been educated in such knowledge, let's get into talking about fish themselves.
Okay.
I've got probably 20-something questions here that I want to throw at you in no particular order.
Okay.
That some have been given from our viewers, some came from my head, and some suggestions that you said, we might want to talk about. This one came from a viewer, a good friend of mine, but he fishes Lake Lanier a ton. Mm-hmm. And he wants to know what your opinion is on stripers in Lake Lanier. Good for the bass, bad for the bass. What's your opinion on stripers in Lanier?
That's a good question. I think they're essential to the fishery. And I think the state biologists are using them because they know they have to. They're going to be controlling those shad populations that are out in that open water. They're going to pack up in school and run around. That's just the nature of how they hunt, the way they behave. And that's what the biologists use them for. Open water. They're not relating to structure.
Right.
They're pack hunters, and they're pushing those shad around. So I realize the bass fishermen think that they're probably eating too much of the bait fish, but come on, let's be honest. You've seen the footballs, the spots look like these days. They got plenty to eat in there. And I like the striper because they're going to be pushing those schools of shad around, going to be pushing them up into the rocks. They're going to be moving them around. I think they actually help the spots more than they hurt them.
You think they help the spots. So what you're saying is the state is putting them in there for control of bait and not for money. There's a lot of people that...
I would say that the striper fishing brings a lot of money, and that definitely factors in.
Okay, so but primarily,
I think they're a useful tool.
As a biologist.
Yeah, I like to use them. I've used them before in smaller impoundments.
Really?
Hybrids. Mm-hmm.
Hybrids, okay. What kind of lake? What size lake are we talking about?
3 acres.
Really? Hybrids in 3 acres?
Yeah, they take pellets like catfish, so you can grow massive hybrids in small bodies of water.
Now, do you still have bass in those lakes?
Oh, sure.
Okay, so but the reason is, what's the thinking there?
Well, the lake that I'm thinking of in particular had a shad die off in the summertime. And he was all freaked out. He had lost his shad, so we had to go do a shocking survey. And when I stepped on the pedal, the numbers of thread fins that were still in there were ridiculous. And I said, let's think about adding another predator to help control some of these shad in here. And we just put in about 40 or 50 hybrids to keep the shad numbers a little bit lower so we could alleviate them dying like that. They get high in numbers. Anytime you get any fish population high in numbers, they're going to be low in food, and that's going to affect their immune system. They're going to become more susceptible to disease. I've seen that with bass heavy ponds a lot of times.
Now explain bass heavy. What are we talking bass heavy?
Bass heavy is just a term that we use that it describes the population. It just means there's a few too many bass in it.
Okay.
And you can tell by their weights, the length versus their weight. We use a measurement called relative weight to compare basically that fish that we sampled to the average. And if your fish are below average, that's a real good indication that you have too many of them.
Which is the relative weight. That's the average.
Weight. Yeah, the relative weight is just the average for bass in North America. And if you looked at the chart right now, like 24-inch fish is 8.1 pounds. 12.5-inch fish is exactly 1 pound. I just have those numbers committed to memory.
Right.
But if, say, you're on your pond or your lake or whatever, and you're catching 12.5-inch bass that weigh 3/4 of a pound consistently, there's a sign that you have too many 12.5-inch bass and you need to start keeping some of those. I would start keeping those until their weights improve to average
Now
or better.
You realize you just threw out a faux pas or whatever they call it, and all these guys at bass fish are like, "Whoa, wait a second!
Yeah,
we don't keep bass around here in Georgia."
I know,
Okay,
and
so
that was the biggest problem I've ever had managing fisheries, was actually getting people. They would pay me thousands of dollars to go assess their fishery. I'd tell them keep bass, and they wouldn't do it. And then they'd come back the next year and say, "How many fish did you keep?" None. Well, you're not going to have any improvement in the growth then.
And so what you're saying is if you're on a lake and you're seeing by this relative weight, a lot of these, your recommendation is this, let's get some out.
Yeah, we'll put a slot limit on them, and it's so like consistent. Like I've seen it so many times over and over again. Your slot limit's going to be between usually 12 and 14 inches long. That's the problem area. Those are the fish that you're going to want to harvest. They'll get to 12 inches in a year, and then they'll stay there for 5. And you don't want that. We want those fish to grow. We want those fish to go 12, 13, 14, all up to 20 and reach their potential. And if they're getting stuck, even for a brief period of time, even for a year, well, they just lost a whole year. They just lost a fifth of their life, sixth of their life.
That's what I was going to say. And what's the lifespan of a bass?
7 years or so. I mean, you can get them to 10, but, I'd say the average is probably about 7 years. So if you have a fish that, even gets stunted, like I've seen fish 7 years old that are 12 inches long, they stop growing.
Now, how do you tell the age of a bass?
You can tell the age of a bass 2 ways. The easiest way and the safest way for the fish is to pull a scale. And by pulling the scale, you just look at it under a light magnification on a microscope, like 10 times power. And they lay down growth rings like a tree would lay down growth rings. The lines get a little bit closer in the wintertime and a little further apart. And you can count the number of years the fish has been alive.
That's interesting. I did not know that.
The only other way to do it is to cut the same way, but it's with their ear bone. But their ear bone's inside their head, and you have to kill them to cut it out.
Right,
so,
yeah.
That's a more accurate way to do it, but that's also,
And just kind of describe that. What are you looking for with the ear bone as a biologist? When you're trying to do it, what's it showing?
Just the age of the fish. It lays down layers in there as
Rings
well.
and stuff. Something
you
similar?
would cut the ear bone in half and look in there at the layers and count, just like the scale. It's just more accurate. The scales are kind of open for interpretation. They can be damaged sometimes and give you false, little weird things like that. We try to pull 8 or 10 scales off the fish to make sure we get a good clean one to try to determine their ages. But I didn't really get into to aging fish that much. As long as the fish are above our average relative weight or slightly above average, you don't have to really worry about how old they are. They're growing fine.
Okay, so tell me about a lake that is, you said, bass heavy. Mm-hmm. Now, I assume there's balanced?
Yep, balanced would be what we're looking for.
Right.
And then, for lack of a better term, we'll call another fishery bass light.
Bass light.
Just has probably competing species is the best way to describe that. You're going to have crappie, or some other fish that's limiting your bass, competing with your bass for food, and taking food right out of their mouth so they can't eat. And
Let's go back to the hybrids that you put in the lake. Why not crappie?
Crappie are bad for most small lakes, and I don't recommend stocking them ever. They spawn earlier in the spring than largemouths, and since they get that jump start, their babies are around the edge and feeding on zooplankton and small fish that the bass should be feeding on. So they're literally at almost like a microscopic, they're tiny little clear fish, but they're already eating what the bass want to eat when they come off the bed. What even worse, once the bass hatch out, the crappie fry are big enough to eat the bass fry. So crappie can actually reduce the numbers of bass in a small lake or pond.
Okay, and the hybrids don't do that.
The hybrids don't do that because they don't spawn.
So you're sterile hybrids.
The white, they're cross between stripers and white bass, and they just don't really spawn.
Sterile. Okay.
They don't really give you a spawn in there. So if I put 50 hybrids in there, I've got 50 hybrids in there. But if I've got crappie in my pond, I have no idea what they're doing year in and year out to my bass reproduction without checking it.
Okay. All right, that's excellent. All right, so one of our viewers named Kyle Rogers, he submitted a question, and his question was it was like 6 or 7 in one. But I'm going to condense it down, and so he'll know what I'm talking about. A good example in one of our previous podcasts with the Fluke Master, he came in, Gene Jensen, he talked about how Alabama, South Carolina, Tennessee, all the states surrounding Georgia, you can make a living as a largemouth guide because those states promoted the largemouth fisheries. Mm-hmm. It seems to be something that's absent here in Georgia, especially, I would say, Macon North at least. I don't know how South Georgia is, but up here, it's spotted bass, spotted bass, spotted bass. And so kind of what he wanted to know is there a reason why they're doing that? Or is there a reason why they're not promoting it, trying to increase the largemouth habitat? What's your take on that, even if you can answer that question?
Well, that's a tough one. I would say here in North Georgia, we've got perfect lakes for spotted bass. They got the perfect habitat. You've got clear water, got cliffs, rocks. They love it. That's how they breed. They have to have that to breed. And once you get spotted bass, say into Lake Lanier, there's no point in managing for largemouth bass anymore. You have to deal with both of them. You're not going to get rid of the spots. They're always going to be there. And we really just, our deep, clear water lakes are really ideal for spotted bass. And plus we have a problem with people moving fish around. We blueback herring, flathead catfish in South Georgia. The snakehead catfish the snakehead fish has popped up there in Gwinnett.
Right, yeah.
People moving stuff around. So I think here for North Georgia, the biologists probably have their hands tied a little bit with the spots. They have to manage them and the largemouth together. But you're right; they don't have a dedicated trophy bass fishery, and I would like to see that. I think they might come at it from a different ideology. Maybe the public waters need to be more easy for everyone to fish, so to speak,
right,
instead of just for trophy management. It seems that most of our lakes are managed that way for numbers and not particularly trophy size. But I don't work for the DNR. That's up to them.
But so you're theorizing it's more for the public enjoyment than it is for the trophy aspect.
Yes. Yeah, I feel like they kind of manage the deer population the same way.
Yeah, that's why you can kill so many, I guess, like that. Okay, so let's get into the actual fish itself. Okay, so I've got several questions here. One from Travis Samples. Actually, let's start with Tyler McGinnis first. Do fish have feelings or have feeling in their mouth or lips? Do fish have feeling in their mouths or lips?
Simple answer, yes.
Okay.
Not like our mouths and lips, though. They don't have the nerve endings in there like we do. And everybody's picked up a catfish. Everybody's picked up a bluegill who's probably watching. You've been finned by a fish before. Bass are designed to eat that, like a pin cushion in their mouth. Their mouths are tough. That cartilage is tough. And even though they can feel it, they just don't have like what we would have as far as a nervous system in there. And it's subject for debate on whether or not they even feel that as pain, because they just don't have enough pain receptors in there to really tell that they're being injured in any kind of way. So yes, they do have feeling, but no, it's not similar to ours. Their mouths can handle hooks, their mouths can handle fish fins, and they're just designed for it. So hooking a fish doesn't hurt them at all. If that's kind of where it sounds like that's going.
I think so.
Yeah.
Okay. Another viewer named Lee Sant, he wanted to know if fish can taste.
They absolutely can taste.
Okay.
Great example are your channel catfish. They have taste buds all over their body. They're in higher numbers in their mouth and on their barbels, but they're like a swimming tongue. And they can taste their way around, basically. It's interesting to think about, though, because when you think about you're in the water, taste and smell kind of become the same thing. Because it's floating in the water. So they do have a sense of smell as well, and water can go in their nostrils and they can smell. But the taste, catfish are covered in taste buds and literally taste their way around. They taught us in school that it was some crazy amount of feet away, 200 feet away or something, that they tested the catfish. They could tell by the reaction of the fish that they could taste up to that distance away. But ironically enough, their tank was also that long they couldn't go any further away from the fish.
So they couldn't. It's possible it could have been
possible
even more.
it could be even further than the 200 feet.
Okay,
It definitely is, I think.
Well, how about bass? How does that relate to bass? How do they?
They have taste buds as well. They're more localized on their lips and in their mouth, not all over their body, more on their head and inside their mouth, but they absolutely have taste, yes.
Okay, so is it similar to ours on our tongue, or when you say taste buds, we're talking the same thing?
Same thing. Same thing.
Okay. A buddy of ours, Shane Dover, asked that question. You kind of touched on it right then. Sense of smell. You say it's kind of similar to taste. So kind of let's expand on that a little bit.
They have a nose, and the water goes in there, and they can smell those molecules. Absolutely. Let's take salmon, for example. They have proven that, or any fish really that goes up a river to spawn, back out to the ocean, then back up the river, comes back. It's actually their nose that leads them back.
Really?
Mm-hmm. They imprint on the smell of the stream. And the guys who figured that out put a scent in the water. I can't remember what it was. And they let fish go out of a tank. And I believe it was in Oregon. And let the salmon go out to sea. And the next year they came back and came right back up and literally swam right back into the tank they were born in.
Because of the scent.
No, they took the scent then and moved it to another stream, did it again, and those salmon ran up the other stream where the scent was. They didn't come back to the tank.
That's amazing.
So they proved that they use their nose to get back home.
Okay, so how about a largemouth bass or a spotted bass? And I ask this because there's a big market today with scents.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen it. You got your garlics, and I've even got a bottle that a buddy of mine gave that is crawfish. Boiled down crawfish scent.
Sure.
And you've been told, just spray it on that or sprinkle it on that or soak them in that for X amount of time. So does it work? Is that gimmicks? What's your take on that?
That's a great question. I don't think it's a gimmick. But I also don't know I can't quantify how well it works. I know this. I know why I use scents anyway.
Okay.
Have you seen the scents that they kind of look like chapstick? They come it looks just like it's a shad tube or a crawfish tube. It looks like chapstick,
right?
Like a little pasty thing.
I haven't, but
I'll put them on my swim baits when I'm dragging them in the wintertime. Have you ever picked up one of those rubber swim baits? They feel dry and they feel clammy. They feel funny.
Yes.
If you take that stick and you rub it on that rubber fish, it gives it a slime coat. It makes it feel like a fish to me. So I use that scent in that situation when I'm wintertime fishing and I'm just bumping the bottom, just dragging it real slow, and I want that fish to grab it and hold on to it. I'll use that fish scent to try to give it a little more natural feel, because it is a slow presentation. But the fact, like a mouth feel as well, when it goes into their mouth, it feels slimy. It feels like a fish. It doesn't feel like a dry piece of plastic. And that's what I like the scents for.
Okay, so you use it for a totally different way.
Well, I think it works. I do. I think it might, once it's in their mouth, I think it helps them hold it a little bit.
Okay. Why garlic?
I have no idea.
I mean, it seems to be the predominant scent out there. Somebody said, I want to put a worm and I want it to smell like garlic, and the fish like it.
Yeah.
And there's no educational reason as to why fish like garlic, or even if they
Not
do.
that I've ever read.
Okay, so it's just garlic is a gimmick, because it's not natural to the water. So
Yeah, I like to stay with the natural stuff, the shads, the crawfishes, stuff like that. But there's garlic in worms. Some of the worms, they put it in there and different things.
Well, you got glow in the dark worms now. Like real worms are glow in the dark now, and I'm just kind of looking at that. I wonder if that's
I saw
a gimmick.
some of those chartreuse worms.
I've never seen a natural chartreuse worm in the water in my entire life, but maybe it works. Somebody's buying it.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so sense of smell. Anything we can wrap up on that? Did their nose work? Is it like ours, or
Yeah, pretty much the same thing.
I didn't know if maybe it was like a snake, where they could kind of taste the air molecules or something. If it was some kind of
Well, those molecules are floating in the water again.
Right.
So, it's got to float through the water, and it's got to go into their nose, and they got to smell it, or it's got to float through the water and maybe touch a taste bud, and they can taste it. And that's kind of where you draw, it's kind of where a fuzzy line, a gray area is it even taste or smell to a fish,
Right.
Because like a dog, they say that a dog can taste, what it's smelling. Is so
really?
good. Yeah, their sense of smell is so good they can actually taste it. Those molecules it gives them. So it's kind of the same thing.
I got you. Okay. How well do fish hear, or do they hear at all?
They hear very well.
Okay.
They actually hear sound travels in water way differently than it travels through the air. It travels faster.
Okay, let's spend some time right here.
Okay, so we talked about when we age a fish, you would cut the fish's ear out.
Right.
That ear bone is called the otolith, and the otolith sits inside the fish's ear in its head. Just imagine our ear and eardrums without an external ear. Okay, so you've got a bone sitting in, and it has kind of hairs that touch it. And as the sound waves move through the water and move through the fish, it moves that bone.
Makes it vibrate.
And then that's how the fish can hear the sound that's come through the water, because their bodies are soft, but that bone is dense. So once it hits that bone, it creates a vibration and allows them to hear it, just like our eardrum vibrating.
Okay.
Okay, it works the exact same way. It vibrates, and it vibrates that bone in their head.
Now, where is this located? Like, if I'm looking at a bass right here,
in front of the gills and behind the eyes.
in front of the gill, I mean,
Yeah.
very small, not
Right in
noticeable
there.
unless you know what you're looking
You'd
for.
have to dig it out, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's pretty much kind of hidden in the
It's
naked
hidden
eye.
in there. You can't get it from the outside. You have to, if you want the bone out of there, you have to kill them. You
Gotta
have
kill
to
the
dissect
fish.
it out. Yeah.
Okay, and how does that work in conjunction with the lateral line? Because you always hear fishermen talk about the lateral line. They feel it. So now you've got feel and hear. How does that work together with a bass?
Actually, what you'll find as well, a lot of fish, their hearing will go right in with their float bladder. And their float bladder is that little place, if you ever cleaned a fish, in between their backbone and their organs.
Right.
And a lot of our spotted bass fishermen will be very familiar with the float bladder, because they'll blow up when they catch them under 30 feet of water in the wintertime. That float bladder the air is compressed inside of it, and it expands if you pull them out from that deep spot. But that float bladder allows, you'll see fish, it'll be tied kind of into their ear at the front of the float bladder, and that float bladder helps them hear a little bit better. Now, going to your question, to the lateral line, it's a completely different sense. It runs down the side of the fish, from the head all the way to the tail. It looks like a cup, and it has some hairs that are inside it. And as vibrations come through the water, it moves those hairs, and it allows the fish to know what's going on around it. And fish use that lateral line system for a lot of different things, for locating prey, for just knowing what's around them. They also use it for schooling. Have you ever noticed how the schools of fish can turn all at the same time? That's their lateral line system. They're using that.
So different sense, basically.
Basically, yeah. It's basically like if you were at a concert, and you know how you can feel the music, and when you're close to the speakers, you can feel that vibration from there. A fish can feel another fish swimming by it like that. It's very, very sensitive.
And how does it tell? Does it go from, okay, I feel it, now that I hear it, now I see it? Is there an order of which? Because sometimes I've heard that a fish will just feel it and attack.
Yeah.
They know. And I guess my question is, how do they know? Is it a frequency that
it's gonna be a frequency. Yeah. Now you're getting into like real theoretical stuff.
And that's fine.
But I can give you my opinion on that.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think like spinnerbaits. I like spinnerbaits because they put off a vibration, right? Well, so does a fish swimming in the water. And I think if you can be around the same vibration as what they're feeding on, you have an advantage.
So you're basically saying, okay, let's get deep here. Let's go down the rabbit hole. You said rabbit hole.
Yeah.
So you almost, if in theory you knew that a thread-fin shad gave off a frequency of X.
Right.
Not only could you match a bait to the size of it, you can match a bait to
the frequency of it.
X frequency.
Right.
And that's a theory that you think, or is that something you think is provable?
Well, I think it's provable in a way because it kind of goes back to match the hatch. You know, how many times have you heard that?
I've heard it a lot.
Yeah. So if you're fishing in a lake that has shad and you're fishing a shad imitation, like a spinnerbait, you're going to get that pulsing. Well, what happens when you change from a willow leaf to a Colorado blade? You're changing the frequency.
changing the feel along the lateral line too and everything.
Yeah. So switching blade sizes is going to give different vibrations off rattle traps. Or on the flip side of that, most of the lures, especially your crankbaits these days, have rattles in them. So I'll intentionally buy the ones that don't.
Okay, and why is that?
Because they're different.
Because they're different. Now,
they're still giving off a frequency with the way they're moving through the water. The rattle is irrelevant to me.
Without giving it away, we have a video coming up in which the angler that we are, videoing speaks to that. Sometimes.
Really?
Yeah, he likes to go quiet.
How lucky am I?
Yeah, that's right. if they're not hitting it, so you kind of match that. But I think that's an interesting thing that, I'm 48 years old. I've never once even thought about the frequency of a bait.
Yeah.
Relative to what you're fishing with. When I say the bait, or threadfin, what you're trying to mimic.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's really important. Yeah. And I think that has a lot more to do with those types of lures than has been proven.
So you think that helps a fish at night, stuff like that, low level, muddy water?
Absolutely. The lateral line is so sensitive. They actually did it with northern pike on the study that I read. They removed their eyes and their ears, but kept the fish alive. Kept them in a tank and, just fed them live fish, just like you'd feed any northern pike. And the northern pike could catch the fish with no eyes and ears, just based on its lateral line system. Had no problem feeding.
That's amazing.
No problem.
So I don't know how many people will listen to this and they'll be, really paying a lot of attention to frequency. And in a year or two, we're going to have, a frequency-laden baits,
Maybe we should patent it.
We should do it. I think so. Okay, so I've heard many times that a bass has no memory, a bass has a limited memory, and a bass has an absolute indefinite memory like ours.
Right.
All right, what's your experience with that? What's the book? Okay, so what's the book say? What's the book say?
Okay, well, I can, let's see. What's the best way to explain that? Okay. I managed lakes for 20 years, and a lot of what we did was increase the numbers of fish that could live in a pond. Now, how do you do that? You introduce energy, and we introduce it in the form of feed. So if you put a feeder or you get a trash can full of feed and you go down and feed your fish every day, you're throwing food directly to your bluegill, which in most small lakes is your primary forage. They're getting bigger, and then that in turn makes the bass bigger. But on your lakes with your feeders, they come on every day at a certain time. Mm-hmm. And after, where I'm going with this,
yes,
after a certain amount of time, those bluegills start moving to that feeder about 5-10 minutes before it cuts on.
They know.
They get trained to it, okay? So with that in mind, you can train a fish to eat. But you have to train it, just like a dog. You have to do it every day. Okay? And as long as you do it every day, they'll come eat every day. If you stop feeding them, they'll forget. Okay?
So now, is it more of a repetitive thing?
Absolutely. It needs to be done every day. Okay? And once it's done every day, they'll come and eat every day. Now, let's take that same pond, and I don't care, take any lure, just whatever, Rapala. And you go down there and you throw a Rapala in there every day, and you start catching bass on it, right? You start catching bass on it. Well, if you keep using it every day, it stops working. You ever notice that?
They figure out it hurts.
If you can train a fish to eat, you can train a fish not to eat.
Okay, that's your experience. So that's what you're going with on that.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so
it's called lure resistance, and that has been proven.
Okay, lure resistance.
Mm-hmm.
Any big studies on that or anything?
Oh, yeah. I read a study out of University of Illinois back in early 2000s, which basically proves just that. If you consistently fish a small body of water, or even Lake Lanier, there's lure resistance there, You go to some other reservoir where there's not nearly as much fishing pressure, and the fish are easier to catch. Am I wrong?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
It's so, because they've been trained. There's so many fishermen throwing so many lures and catching them so many times, it's conditioning the fish against the lures. So what I would do on my personal lakes that I was managing, if I was running into what I thought was that, because they would generally say things like, I've thrown every lure that Bass Pro has and I can't catch a fish out here. And my answer to that would be stop.
Stop
Fishing. Give them a month. Let them forget about all that because they can't remember it forever.
So it is limited.
It is limited. And if you stop and just give your fish a break, they'll start biting again.
Okay. Got a question from Travis Samples. We've discussed it on several of the podcasts, and it'd be nice to have a biological answer here. You hook a fish deep.
Mm-hmm.
Let's do it several different ways. Let's talk about first about if you hook one in the gills.
Okay.
Because you and I are talking before this podcast. You mentioned something to me about fish bleeding. So let's go. You have hooked a fish in the gill. You let it go. What's going to happen to that fish and why?
It's going to die. Anytime you get them in the gills, it's not much different than stabbing somebody in the lung. They're not going to live, you know. If it's a nick, if it's just a small amount, they might be. But, you know, when you get that red, it's just really pouring. That fish is, even though it swims away, it's low probability for survival, let's put it that way.
So the mortality rate is
extremely high, yes.
And we're talking in the gill.
In the gill when there's blood. Now, if you get them in the gill, like on the raker, you know, and you can get that out.
What is the raker?
The gill rakers, those little, the bones in the gill, you know, and those little, they have those little points that kind of hold the fish in there. Those gill rakers are there to protect the gill, or anywhere in the arches of the gill. If you get a hook in there and you get it out and you don't have any blood, you're good to go.
Okay, but if we get lots of blood,
any blood at all, really, you're probably dealing with less than 10% chance of survival. I would guess.
Might as well take that
you
one.
Might
home.
as well fry him up. Yeah, he's probably done.
All right, now let's take it and let's talk about one that is hooked deep, almost in the gullet or whatever they want to call it. What is that? What is the terminology for that?
I just call it gut hooked.
Gut hooked. Okay,
Yeah.
so you've got it gut hooked where the hook is exposed, not buried yet. We'll get to that next. So now we got a deep hook. Exposed.
Okay.
Now, one of those where, you know, I've seen people, and we probably did it in our youth, you just yank that joker and eventually
that's
it
not
pulls
good.
it. Right,
Yeah, no, that's
we
not.
grew up and figured that out, but that hook.
Okay, that hook, I would go in from the gill side and turn it around, try to get the eye pointing back down its throat, and try to do that all at the same time. And if you practice it a little bit, you can get your finger down their throat, and you can turn and get that out.
Higher mortality rate or better?
It's hard to say because you can't see where it's injured. If it's all the way down, it's probably done. It's probably poked a hole in its stomach, and that's not going to heal. It's probably going to kill it. If it's exposed like you're talking about, it'll probably live, but you can't do that much damage getting it out. It really is how good the job the fisherman does getting that hook out.
I think I've heard, I think it might have been Scott Barnes, something about clipping or it might have been Gene Jensen on our last podcast talked about clipping off the barb and then pulling it back through.
That's a real smart way to do it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if you can. Now let's get into in the stomach. And the reason I ask this is because the old saying that I've heard all my life was, if a fish has a hook swallowed, just cut the line, it'll rust itself out, and that fish will live.
Yeah. Again, it's hard to say because you don't know what it's done to the internal organs. Did it go through the stomach? You know, is it poking into its intestines, or is it poking into someplace else? Or is it just caught it someplace in the throat where it hasn't hit any vital organs? If it hasn't hit any vital organs, it'll be fine. It will rust out. But if it's hit vital organs, it's dead. It's not going to live. And there's just no way to tell. So if you got one like that and you want to let it go ahead and let it go. It will rust out if it hasn't punctured anything.
So it just depends on which way that barb's
Just
turned.
Complete luck. Yep.
Okay. All right. You might have mentioned it earlier with the spotted bass. You mentioned the air bladder. Mm-hmm. Okay, and a lot of these lakes up here in North Georgia are deep. Even the local reservoir here, Latham, it's 100 foot deep. You can catch spots over 60 foot of water. They'll suspend in 30 or 40 foot of water, and you have to fizz them.
Yeah,
that's the terminology. Now, I'd like you to explain the science behind the air bladder, what causes the air bladder to expand, and what your thoughts are with fizzing. If it's good, if it's bad, will the fish live? Because we've heard some conflicting stuff here in the last month. So what is the official book on?
Okay, so what's happening there is not different than a diver getting the bends. Okay, you're down, it's 30 feet is the line. Once you get under 30 feet, you're going to start having this problem. If your fish are shallower than that, it's just not deep enough, not enough pressure on them. But there's so much pressure, and what the float bladder does is you see a bluegill just sit like this, right? It doesn't. It's not swimming.
So a bluegill has it too.
Sure, bluegill have them, bass have them, trout have them, most fish have them, and it allows them to do this. It gives them that neutral buoyancy like a diver. You know how the diver adds weights to go down and like that? Okay, so the float bladder is in there. It's like a balloon inside of it, and it just gives them ability to sit there so they don't have to swim all the time. It gives them that balance, okay?
Almost like they can just hover.
Yep.
Right in that spot.
Yep, they just got a little balloon inside their body there. Now on your bass, say, that goes in, there's not an opening like in a trout. A trout has a hole. A trout can gulp air and put air in its float bladder. It can also belch air and take air out.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
A bass can't do that. A bass, it has to go through its bloodstream. It has to work its way out and then go out. It actually ends up going out through the gill is what it actually ends up happening. When the blood gets into the gill, it's just like osmosis. It moves from an area high concentration to low concentration. That gas moves its way out, and it takes time
that's
for
how they
a bass.
release it, though.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
So if a bass is under 30 feet and it wants to come up, it has to do it like a diver. It has to come up in stages and let that compressed gas kind of escape their body, and then once they get up and get that gas out, they're good to go. They can operate, on the shallower waters.
Okay.
But let's say you do catch a bass at 30 feet or 35 feet, and it blows up on you. You pulled him up.
So you pulled him up too fast, faster than he can actually naturally expel it out.
Yeah. So now that pressure's gone and that gas expands, and the fish can't dive back down. It really restricts them.
Which is why you see it floating sideways in the live well.
Yep. It's basically like it's tied to a buoy. It's its own natural buoy, but it's stuck now. And that's not good for it too either, because now something inside its body has expanded way bigger than it's supposed to. It's putting pressure on its internal organs. It's not good for the fish at all. So you would want to, lance that like you talked about. Get the air, go in. I'm sure there's a million YouTube videos on how to do it right. Use a syringe. You really want to work on your technique on that if you're going to be doing that, because you don't want to get into the belly. You don't want to pierce through that float bladder and then into the organs. That'll kill the fish. But as long as you go in through the meat, get into the float bladder and let that air out, let the fish back. It'll heal. It'll be fine.
Okay, because we've heard that if you let it go, that fish was going to die in 6 months because it never heals. You're saying it will heal.
It will heal, yeah.
Okay, what about the what is the better way to do it? Through the mouth or through the side? Or does it really matter?
I don't think it matters. Whatever you're best at, whatever you're most comfortable with.
What gives you the less chance of poking an internal organ in your mind?
I like going through the back a little bit better.
Okay.
Yeah. You can kind of feel it. It has tension, and once it gets in there, you can kind of feel it pop through.
It gives a little bit.
Yeah, you can feel it once you get the technique for it. And really what you can do is you can see it. It goes down like a balloon.
Right.
You can hear it come out. But yeah, that's to me, I like it through the back a little bit better than through the mouth.
Okay, we had a gentleman in one of our fellow anglers in a tournament. For some reason, Josh and I had one of these. We had a fizzer on the boat, and I don't know why. I guess normally because our boat turns into like a tornado hits it once we start tournament fishing. For some reason, everything we own is spread out. We couldn't find the fizzer.
Yeah.
So an angler and his co-angler came by, and we asked him, do you have a fizzer? And, they were talking about, but he also had these little weights with little clips that you hook to the anal gland or the anal fin, and another one that keeps the fish naturally turn like this.
That's interesting. I haven't seen that.
I haven't seen one either before, but eventually I guess the fish works itself.
Sure.
And what you're saying is the reason that it lives now is because it's had time to get that air out naturally.
Yeah, it basically has to exhale all that extra air out.
And why can't it do it while it's laying on its side? Why? Because I've heard that the fish is going to die if it doesn't happen.
Yeah, it generally will. It takes them a long time for that to happen, and I don't know that thing will work, but I don't know what keeping them upright has anything different.
So you think
it's the pressure on the internal organs that really concerns me more than them not being able to get down to eat.
Okay, so we're
Yeah.
talking about and I think the reality of that is in a tournament situation, keeping it alive long enough to weigh it in so you don't get a dead fish penalty.
Right.
So what you're saying is it's better to fizz that fish than to use these weights because
I would.
because of pressure on the fish.
Yeah, it's not good for them.
Okay, well that makes perfect sense. So all right, now let's talk eyesight. The eyesight of a largemouth bass and even a spotted bass. Kind of give me first question, the range of sight in, say, clear water. How good are their eyes?
Just like ours.
Just like ours.
Just like ours with like a swim goggles or whatever on. They're very similar. The eye structures work very similarly. So it's going to be limited to visibility. And in fisheries terminology, we use a little, it's called a secchi disc, SECCHI, I think, or SECCI. It's one that's secchi disc. It's a white disc and a black disc. It says half white, half black, and you lower it into the water. And you literally just put it down until you can't see it anymore and record that depth. Fish they're not going to be any different than us. They're going to be able to see about that distance in the water.
Okay.
Yeah.
Same eye structure, like not how a white-tailed
Rods,
deer is
cones,
totally everything.
yep.
Cones the same.
Yep. Now, your predatory fish are going to have a few more rods in there for night vision type stuff. The thing about vision on the fish is, I guess the most complex thing to think of is they're in a medium. So it's kind of like us being in a fog. You know, there's going to be floating particles in the water, right? And those floating particles, if they're plankton, it's going to give the water a green color. If they're dirt, it's going to give it a brown color. If you're in South Georgia, give it a black color, that tannic acid, you know.
Right.
And here's, I like this. No one ever gets this one right. The most visible color in water. Everybody asked me that question.
I was getting ready to ask it because you and I talked about it before this. So
I'll just cut to the chase. The most visible color in water is the color of the water. And it works like this. How does your vision work? Okay, I'm looking at this microphone. It's a black microphone. So that microphone is absorbing every single color except for black. Black is being reflected off, going back into my eye. My brain processes that and tells me that's a black microphone.
right.
Okay, so it's absorbing everything. Now we go back to that medium that we were talking about because the fish are suspended in that, right? Let's say the water's green. That means every single color is being absorbed by the water except for green. Therefore, some color of green is the most visible color in green water.
And this is by the books.
This is by the books.
By the books.
And I can prove it to you, too. The next time you're in a real foggy situation, you know, that white out kind of fog, check and see. Is it easier to see a white truck or a black one? It's always easier to see a white truck in the fog.
Really? Mm-hmm. And is it just the way our brain processes?
It's just the way it's just reflective. It's just the way physics is.
Okay, so now we're getting physics in the fishing.
It's the way your eye works.
So we've got frequencies, bait frequencies, and now we're doing physics. So you're saying, and I'm going to use Latham because it's close to here.
Sure.
It has a greenish. Last time we were fishing it, it had a very greenish tint. Mm-hmm. So we're going to assume plankton type life in the water.
Yep.
So if I were fishing it, green pumpkin, something of that color will be the most visible color to a fish in that water.
Correct.
Which means that, it's pretty good because green works pretty good over there. Okay.
And it doesn't mean that the fish are always going to bite that color.
It's just what they can see the best.
Right. And I usually defer to those types of things on the tough days. You know, when I'm not getting a lot of bites, I'll start matching color, watercolor, and doing that, and doing the opposite. You know, what's the opposite of green? Or, you know, go black, go white, go chartreuse. You know, go all over the place. But if I'm having a tough day, I'm always matching watercolor to lure color.
And how does that work just down in South Georgia with the tannic?
Black. Just fit black lures in black water.
Makes a little bit of sense. I have not heard that, so that's pretty good because I guarantee you.
Biggest fish I ever caught was that way.
Here's what I'm going to do, and people are going to listen to this. maybe tonight when we get home, we're going to put a poll out. We're going to put a poll out and ask the people on Fish North Georgia, what is the most visible color? We will ask this question. And so by the time we get this podcast to air, we will have time to have, gotten some very good answers.
That's what Dr. Reiner taught us at Georgia. So no one's ever repeated that to me either. I've asked that question to a lot of fishermen. No one's ever given me that answer back.
Well, I would have never said the color of the water
Yeah.
is the most visible color to a fish in that water.
Yep, sure is. And now that's true up to about, once you get down to about 25 feet, everything's black down there. It's dark.
Which leads into another question about vision. Why are we throwing chartreuse colored baits deep, stuff like that? If the
It
light,
works.
well, but if the light is gone and you say pretty much everything's black, what makes the bass see that chartreuse? Or how about just a worm with a chartreuse tail? What is it about that? I can see it up shallow maybe, but down deep.
That's a great question. And again, once you get to a certain depth, it's all black. It's all dark down there.
And so then now they're relying more on their ear bone and their lateral line.
They're going to be, they're definitely going to be relying on their
Back to
lateral
frequency.
line. Back to that frequency, sure.
This is like conspiracy theories, fishing conspiracy theories. I'm loving
But
it.
if I'm fishing in 30 feet of water, I will use black worms a lot just because it doesn't really matter.
So no sense in going out and buying that color worm.
Not necessarily. I mean, like Lake Lanier, you've got you've got a lot of good water clarity down there. You're going to get light penetration a little bit further in your clear water lakes than in your stain lakes.
Okay.
So that will make a little bit of difference. But also too, you have to consider what's the surface of the water look like. Is it choppy? Is it clear?
And why is that important?
Well, think about it, The light is going to be refracted. It's almost going to look like a strobe light with a chop on the water, right? It's going to give it a different quality than if the water was just flat calm. It's not going to be refracting the light in that way.
And we're still talking deep, fish that are down deep.
Any depth, really.
Okay.
And you'll see bass, use their specialized rods and cones in their eyes for that limited light. Their eyes, predatory fish's eyes are really set up for dawn and dusk type situations. It gives them an advantage, and they use that advantage. But the light is going to change depending on cloud cover, sunny or not. It's going to change on how windy it is. It's going to change on how much rain you've had. How many particles do you have in your water? What's the turbidity of the water? If it's just muddy water, you're not going to get a whole lot of light very deep, And I mean, I don't really worry about colors too much in muddy water. I'll go with my chartreuse sometimes, and I'll go with my browns. That's about it.
Okay, so and makes sense. So back to that's what colors they can see.
Yeah.
In the water and all like that. Now we're talking bass. Now I imagine if we really wanted to get into it with trout and stuff, that all changes a little bit, or does that stay the same?
Well, you're still dealing with predatory fish. Their eyes are going to be similar. They're going to be a little bit better for low light conditions than say like a bait fish of some kind. Their eyes are going to be set up differently. There'll be more cones and fish, like say that are on a coral reef, where the colors are more important, and seeing different colors in the fish and stuff. Those fish will be set up to see better color than say a bass, but a bass definitely can see color.
Okay, all right. Now let's talk about Shane Dover. Gave me another question. He's gonna love me mentioning his name. You'll have to meet Shane one day. He's a really good guy. He would love to fish with you and pick your brain because he's a jig fisherman when it comes to these jig colors, and he studied crawfish and stuff and how their colors are different through the year and all that stuff.
Sure, yeah.
So he's real big on the color thing like that. But he asked a good question. The spawn. Catching females. I would assume probably not keeping them. Maybe he was asking if you keep them, but how about just catching them in general? How does that affect a fishery? And let's start with a pond and move up to say, you can get to Lake Lanier if you want to go that big, but say a pond to a reservoir, 300, 400, 500 acres, and then so forth. If you get some heavy fishing during the spawn.
I don't worry about it. That doesn't hurt them. I've never really been in a situation where I can say that, oh, wow, the fishermen have really messed up the bass reproduction. Most of the lakes that I shock are bass heavy and need to be harvested. So if I could get some limited bass reproduction on some of the places, I would be happy to have it because I don't want those fish coming in every year. It makes my life hard. I would not worry about that at all. You can catch a bass off a bed, put it back, she'll go right back to that bed and be fine.
So you're saying that the stress, there's no undue stress as far as, I mean,
if
even if it was, it doesn't matter.
Nah. In here where we live in the southeast, I am not worried about bass reproducing. Let's put it that way. Unless you've got a crappy problem or something, it's inhibiting it that way. But as far as them just making babies, the fishermen aren't really hurting them that much. If you're pulling them off the beds left and right and keeping them, that's not helping them out. But nobody keeps any bass anyway, so it doesn't matter.
Well, that's true. That is true. So, okay, so let's take that and go into tournament fishing. Sometimes it's said that catching a bass off a bed, taking it to the weigh-in, and then releasing it there is bad for the fish.
For the reproduction wise.
I guess so.
Yeah. I really wouldn't worry too much about that either because they're probably just going to lay more eggs and spawn again if they can't get back to their nest, if they're taken so far away. And I have seen studies on big reservoirs like Lanier where about 50% of the fish that are caught from anywhere in the lake return to that spot within a couple of weeks. So it's very possible they could just simply swim back over there to their nest and get right back on it. It just depends on how far you move them.
Right.
But they know where they are and they can go back.
Okay, that's something to consider. Now, what about the, how do I want to put it? Morals is not the right word to use. It's kind of like some people look down on guys that catch bass in these tournaments when they're on bed.
Like that, yeah.
Like it's a thing. But after listening to you for a little bit, you're like, they need to take some bass out of the lake anyway.
Usually, yeah. It depends on the population of the fishery, I wouldn't want to say it's, the worst thing you could do or the best thing you could do, but I don't frown upon those guys so much. If you can catch a bass off the bed, go ahead. It's not going to hurt the fishery. We got plenty of bass, plenty of reproduction. That doesn't really bother me.
Okay. What about summertime fishing? A lot of the tournaments have gone from 5 fish mostly to the year to 3 fish because it's harder to keep them alive, which is going to lead into us talking about fish care in a second. Mm-hmm. Any opinions on that? Or again, you're like, well, you probably need to take some fish out anyway. So.
Yeah, usually. If it's a bass heavy place, you definitely, the mortality is good for the lake.
Which is different than everything we hear out there.
Oh, I know. Well, catch and release is great. If you're talking about a place like Commerce Reservoir, where it's a light bass population in there. I'm never going to keep a bass out of that place. I'm always going to return the fish there because they need to be in there. There's just not that many. But on the flip side of that, if I go to Bear Creek, I'm keeping everything I catch.
And Bear Creek is where?
It's over East Jackson near Athens. It's about a 500-acre reservoir over there, and it's the last I read from the fisheries studies, it's 2013. It was pretty bass heavy.
Okay.
So if I get hook mortality in a place like that, I am not worried about those fish. They need to be harvested.
And I'm not sure if we covered it or not, but you and I had talked definitely off air about when we were talking relative weight, that you had come up with something that would go like on a golden rule to help a fisherman or help fishermen kind of gauge the lake. Yeah.
Understanding the balance of your pond is important, and understanding the balance of the fishery, even a big like Bear Creek over there. If you had a tournament out there, say, I'd want to know that it's bass heavy. And how do I know that? Well, I compare it to the average. So I start catching fish and I look at that chart, and I have a scale that I use, and it just basically gives the length of the fish across the top and the average weight across the bottom. So I can look at it real quickly and say, like we talked about, 24 inches should be 8 pounds. So I can use that scale and say, all right, this fish should be 8 pounds. Then I put it on a scale, it weighs 9. That gives me information. If it weighs 6, that gives me information. Okay.
And how come nobody talks about this?
I don't know.
I mean, I'm being I've never heard it even discussed, and I'm around some really good fishermen.
Yeah,
And-
I think
nobody talks
That's a
about
great
that.
question, and I used to tell my clients like this. This is a lot like NASCAR, what we're talking about, in a way. Fishermen are like drivers, and I'm like the mechanic. Mechanics don't drive. Mechanics fix.
Right.
Drivers drive. So your bass fishermen are going around real fast, driving around, catching these fish. Okay? That has nothing to do with putting the engine together. You know what I mean?
Right.
So if you look at it that way, you see the difference. You know, I can't sit here and give you a lot of tips on how to catch fish at Lake Lanier. I don't know them. You know, I'm not that type of fisherman. You know, I can tell you a couple things that I do. I've caught fish once.
Right. Right.
But yeah, but I can tell you, you know, about fisheries populations and dynamics and what to look for to clue yourself in. Going back to the bass heavy, we could talk about, you know, how would you game plan if you know you're going to Bear Creek and you know it's a bass heavy pond or reservoir? How would you game plan that?
Well, let's do it. Let's go. Let's go there.
All right. So the first thing I know is there's too many bass and they're all going to be about 12 inches long.
Sounds like Cedar Creek, doesn't it? Yeah, Cedar Creek.
And then I'm going to look on my chart, on my scale, and I'm going to say, all right, I'm catching 12.5-inch fish that weigh 3/4 of a pound. They should weigh a pound. So I've done that consistently. You know, I've caught 10, 15, however many. You just track it, you know, keep an eye on it. And you've determined, all right, there's too many bass in here. It looks like a bass heavy fishery. But we're in the middle of a tournament, and we want to try to catch a kicker. Well, what I would do in that situation is start fishing with something that looks like a 8-inch bass, a jerk bait, a glide bait. Your bigger bass are going to key on the most available forage, the most readily available forage there. It doesn't matter what the fish species are. And if the most readily available thing to eat is a bass, then that's what those big fish are going to be eating.
Bass eating bass.
Bass eating bass. And in fact, we don't even really measure. We were taught in school, don't even really worry about the fish that are under 10 inches on your largemouth, the weights. They're usually always weigh right. And they're probably not going to live till next year anyway.
Because they're going to get eaten.
They're going to get eaten.
Really? Nobody thinks about that.
Yeah. I think about that when I fish with jerk baits. Everybody's like, oh, it's a minnow imitation. I said, it's not a minnow imitation. It's a bass imitation.
Because that's what they normally eat.
Mm-hmm. So I'll go in a bass-heavy lake like Bear Creek. I'm definitely going to keep like a profile. I'm looking for a fish that not only has the colors of a bass, but also that long, skinny profile of the bait. You know, and I might even change the colors of the bait. It might be chartreuse. It might be something crazy, but the profile is very important. That long, narrow. If I'm trying to catch a kicker, I want something that looks very much like a bass. If I'm in a lake with a lot of gizzard shad, I want something that looks like a gizzard shad. You know, the profile and the color. That's very important.
And that's for your kicker. Go catch your limit of 12-inch fish and then look for that kicker.
There was a pond that we did some work on at Georgia. It's down near the nuclear power plant down there. And it was a 750-acre impoundment that had no fishing pressure. They wouldn't let anybody on the plant to fish it. And then they left it alone. Nobody ever touched it. And a guy did a PhD on, it was like heavily fished, moderately fished, not fished, and compared the catch rates. And it was interesting. It was a situation where you could throw about 30 casts in a row and catch 30 bass in a row.
Because they'd never seen nothing.
They had never seen any kind of lures. They'd never had any kind of pressure. They just jumped all over everything and hit the water.
Right.
But it was extremely bass heavy. And there was two sizes of bass. There was 12 inchers and there was fish that could eat 12 inchers.
Again, back to that, two sizes.
Yep. So again, if I'm in a bass heavy impoundment and I've figured that out, I'm definitely want to keep some bigger baits, some 8-inch, 10-inch glide baits. You know, I want to fish with bigger things, even bigger crankbaits that look like bluegill, because a bass heavy pond is a trophy bluegill pond. You're limiting the numbers of bluegill. Therefore, the ones that are there have plenty to eat, and they grow to trophy sizes if they don't get eaten.
That makes sense. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm going to throw a lake at you. I don't know if you've ever fished it, but Yahula Reservoir up in Dahlonega.
Never
you
been
ever
there.
Okay.
No.
So we're talking maybe 100 acres.
Okay.
Fairly shallow compared to most lakes around there. Now you can go catch 12-inch fish. Lots of them. Now, most tournaments there will be, especially during the summer as it warms up, will be 5 fish and 6.28 pounds wins the tournament.
Right.
Now, a lot of guys that fished it a long time ago say it used to be full of big bass.
Mm-hmm.
Now they have said that people keeping them have brought that out, fishing pressure, whatever. But it's really hard to catch a quality fish. You'll see one every once in a while.
Mm-hmm.
But do you think that a lake that size could have something to do with the fishing pressure, or are we back to that lake's probably got the big fish? They're eating those 12-inch fish. Were we back to that, something like that? Because there's no forage really other than bluegill, maybe a little perch, crappie, and that. I mean, just your standard fish. There's no threadfin, nothing like that.
Right.
So do you think that would be something?
That sounds very much like a bass heavy impoundment. They've stunted. There's just too many bass.
And there's just not enough.
There's just not enough forage coming off. There's enough to keep them alive. There's not enough to keep them growing.
And that's just a guess with you never having even seen it.
Never having seen it, and just knowing that 90% of the places that I put in a shocking boat in the water, we're telling them to harvest bass.
Okay. So you think, even though all the locals will say, people keep the fish out here all the time, you're saying it probably needs to take a few more out.
Yeah, it would be the other way.
Without knowing, of course.
Based on my shocking experience, it's going to go the other way. If you've got a situation where people are over harvesting the fish, it's going to be, you're never going to catch a bass, right? The bass population is going to be light, right? It's not going to be many fish. So now what does that mean, though? That means each individual fish has plenty of food, and they're going to be bigger. So if it was an over harvest situation, you would see big bass, not a bunch of small ones.
Very similar to commerce.
Very similar to exactly like commerce.
That's what I was wanting to hear you say. Because I'm trying to put 2 to 2 together in my brain up here and thinking, I go over there and catch little fish all day long. Mm-hmm. Or at least, Josh and I are very good at catching little fish. I don't know what the rest of them are doing, but for the most part, that's what we see.
Yep.
You're looking 12, 13-inch fish. But that makes sense. If it were over harvested, the fish we would catch would be
huge.
Fewer numbers.
Bigger sizes.
Bigger sizes.
Yeah.
Okay.
It sounds like they're stunted and stuck. But in every single bass heavy pond I've ever been in, there's always some bass that get lucky and get bigger.
Right, because we see that occasionally. We'll see a 7-pounder happen, 4-pounder here. Mm-hmm. But the average fish on that lake is 12 and a half, 13 inches. And everybody that fishes these tournaments know it. So that would be your take. With just going on what the fishermen are telling you as far as catch rates. Mm-hmm. You're going to this lake blind. You got to try to fix it. Your first thing is, given the information that you're telling me, we need to keep some fish.
That sounds like. And I would back that up with just go to the next fishing tournament and take the lengths and measurements there and compare them to the relative weight. And when you see that they're all underweight, there's your answer.
So that might be something we need to do too. And how can we get, or is there something that I think you mentioned? That
I've got them. They're like $5. I got little scales that people can use. I use them. I used it for work. I came up with it. And it's just a quick reference guide.
And how can somebody that wants one of these things get it from you?
Oh, just email me.
Just email you? Okay. Yeah. And what we'll do is at the end of this podcast, we will put out your email like that. Okay. So if you get inundated,
Oh, yeah. I'm sure I'll get run over with bass scales.
But still, that's very interesting to
have. It is. I just like doing it. It's the information that you gain from it. If you know how to think about it, will give you insight. And if you don't know how to think about it, it's pointless information.
Right. Well, we do fish with some very smart guys that do think about things.
They'll figure that out pretty quick. You know what I mean? And you'll figure it out too, like when you get into those situations where the bass population is balanced, or maybe crappie have caused a problem and there's fewer bass in the lake than should be. The first thing you're going to see in that situation is the crappie are going to be the same size. And they're going to be
across the board,
about this big.
About the size of your hand.
About the size of your hand, maybe a little bit smaller. And there's going to be more than you care to keep, count, or eat.
And again, we're still talking about...
And you don't catch many bass, but when you do, you catch a real nice heavy one,
But if you could take some of these crappie out, that would help the bass as well.
I always harvested every crappie I ever shocked up.
You know, I remember now from being younger, my dad always said, my grandfather too, on the little lake. Did you ever come fish that little lake behind our house back in the day?
I probably did.
Probably did. I don't know if I told everybody that we kind of grew up together back in the day. We fished. We ran in the same circles. But my grandfather and my dad always said, if you catch crappie, if nothing else, throw them on the bank.
Yep.
Just get it. Because we only had like an acre lake. It was just a little small one. But we had some really big bass. But they hated the crappie.
Yeah.
Unless we were eating them. You know, and everybody loves to eat crappie. They're good eating fish.
Oh, they're
but,
great.
you know, I've heard, I don't know how many times, just get it out of the water.
It is, yeah. Get them out of there. They just eat bass fry.
Just eat bass fry.
And
Just
they eat what bass want to eat, and they eat what bluegill want to eat. So they compete with everything in the lake for food.
Yeah, they just a little bit of everything. That's right. That's right. Let's do this. Let's get into the handling of a bass.
Okay.
Because you and I had some pretty good conversations already about that. Let's talk first about you've set the hook on a fish and you are reeling it in. The proper way to support a bass, hold a bass, take a bass out of the water.
Sure.
In your eyes.
Okay. I see it on the YouTube a lot, and it drives me crazy.
I know it does. I know it does.
It drives me crazy. They grab the fish and they crank it like this. So the lip is here and the body's almost is flat to the water this way.
Right. They're holding it horizontal instead of vertical.
Instead of vertical. That's a big no-no. If you do that on one of my lakes, you're going to be asked to leave.
And that is why.
The jaw muscle and the cartilage and everything in that joint is so important to a bass. It's like their life. They literally have to have it to survive. And by taking it and wrenching it like this, you're putting all that fish's weight right on those two jaws, right on those two joints.
Right.
And the bigger the fish is, the more pressure you're putting on that jaw. So again, I think it's a condition of bass-heavy situations. People are used to catching small fish, and you can take a 12-inch fish and do like that all day. It's not going to break its jaw. You do it to a 7-pound fish, it's going to bust it. Yeah. And now that fish can't eat, and it's going to die.
And people don't even think about that.
No, they don't. So the proper way to handle a fish, I don't even like hanging them by their jaw, especially if they get over 10 pounds. I'd rather weigh it. I've even got a net that actually you just lift it out of the water and it'll weigh it in the net. That's my favorite. But if I have to get it out of the water, you always lip it here and support the stomach right there by the base, right in there. And that's a good way to support its internal organs. It helps it a little bit. But always use two hands, especially on your big fish. Don't wrench them like that. Do not do that. Don't lay them on the ground. Don't lay them in the dirt. It gets our slime coat off there. And I actually don't even like touching them with my hands. And if I have to touch them with my hands, I always wet them. It helps keep the slime on the fish. And I know you've seen it. And I've had people ask me over the years, they send me pictures of fish that has black.
Right.
Start paying attention to those black marks on the fish. It's always a handprint. You can see the fingers, you can see the palm. And what somebody does is they touch that fish with dry hands. And it peels all of their slime coat off. They put that fish back in the water and a bacterial infection gets in their skin and turns it black. It'll stay black forever. It won't hurt the fish. It's kind of like a tattoo.
But you can tell that
it's been handled, and it's usually right across the middle of the back where they grabbed them like that with a dry hand.
Okay. Well, what about this? What about in kayak fishing though? In these tournaments where they're laying the fish on the golden rule to take a picture of the length.
Again, now you've got support along the whole underside of the fish.
But it doesn't hurt the slime coat as much if you.
Again, I want to wet the scale. I want to keep everything as wet as possible what the fish is going to touch. So I don't really mind the scale as much as I do somebody who just lays it on the ground in the dirt. That drives me crazy too.
So, but a good thing for these kayak fishermen or people that do those kind of tournaments where you're taking a picture of length tournament, just wet it, maybe, and then just a precaution.
A little handful of water, just wet that thing down so it's not completely dry, and the fish will be fine.
Okay, so, but vertical holding, it's not as bad.
It's okay. Okay, but I really like if I'm holding a fish in my kayak, I'm holding it like this. It's down in the water. it's coming out of the water to the scale. It's going right back into the water and away. I'm getting rid of it as fast as I can, and I don't want to suspend it off its jaw. I don't want it shaken. I don't want it. I want to be as careful with that fish as I can be.
Okay.
Especially my big fish, my
Right.
5, 6, 8, 10-pound fish. They're not going to get to 13 pounds with a sprained jaw.
Because you can't eat.
That's it.
Makes sense. Okay, let's talk about bass tournaments. So now we're bringing in the live well.
Bring it in a live well. Now let's just talk about. All right, you caught a fish early, right?
Right.
A nice fish.
Second cast of the day.
Second cast of the day, you got 8.5 in the tank.
Right.
You got to keep that alive. And you got a small tank and a big fish.
Right.
And then you start adding more fish to it. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Or we hope anyway.
Right. All right. Let's just say we do.
Okay.
Say we got a 30-pound stringer in there, and we got it all at 8:30. Now we're just waiting for the tournament to end, right?
Right. Yeah. So.
But we got to keep our fish alive. First thing you need is either one of those, products that they make to save the fish in the live well that turns the water blue. All those things are is salt.
Okay. So why not just use salt?
You can just use some rock salt. Don't use iodized salt.
Why
Don't use
not?
table salt. The iodine is bad for them.
Okay. So rock salt good,
Rock
table salt bad.
Yeah, don't use that.
What is mixed in with the other stuff that turns the water blue? Is it just,
Coloring and they got some stuff that helps the slime coat and a couple other things and little additives in there and everything. But it's mostly just salt.
Okay.
And like when we run them from the fish hatchery, stocking thousands of fish into lakes and stuff, we always just use it's just bulk salt.
okay.
Just non-iodized bulk salt.
Is there how much salt? Let's just say your typical live well, just a handful.
Yeah, throw it in
Okay.
there.
Can you
Now,
put-
do you have the live well that's flushing water all the time?
Well, we fish electric only, so let's do this. We have the live well. A lot of guys use coolers,
Okay, sure.
so let's just take the cooler
All
situation.
right, we got a
first.
cooler.
Because that's harder for these guys, pretty much.
Are you running compressed air or just a regular bilge pump?
We're gonna go regular bilge pump because most of the people that run compressed air, or we're talking big bass boats, big lakes. So
Okay.
on an electric only, that's a very rare thing. In fact, I've never seen compressed air. Not
Really?
saying it's not there.
Okay.
But most people are just running a straight. Put the water in with a little circulating pump.
Well, I'll get you set up with some compressed air
Okay.
real cheap. You're going
There
to
you
want
go.
that. That's
All right.
nice.
There you go.
Okay, so you need to keep your water circulating. Okay. You need to keep that aerator running all the time. It can't switch off because the bass is taking the oxygen out of the water like a sponge. And it's even doing it at a faster rate than normal because it's under stress,
Okay.
right? It's been taken out of its home. It's been stuck in your boat. It's stressed out. And what happens is freshwater fish, just by nature of being freshwater fish, pee a lot.
Okay.
A lot. And it's because the water goes across the membrane in their gill into their system. Their kidneys has to excrete that extra water that's constantly passing in while they breathe. So they just pee all the time, like 20% of their weight a day.
Really?
Yeah.
That's
it's
a lot. You don't ever think. I'm sorry. I've never once thought about a fish peeing because it's in water.
Right. Well, what happens then if it's in your live well starts getting full of ammonia.
Okay.
And that's what that salt helps combat, that ammonia
All
toxicity.
right. So there you go. That's a tip. There you
And that what we're talking about is osmoregulation. And osmoregulation is a term we use to describes the internal salt balance on a fish.
go. The internal salt balance.
Right. Because you have to remember that gill, it's releasing stuff into the water all the time, like through osmosis, because it's such a thin membrane. For oxygen to be able to pass across and get into the blood, other things are leaving. And part of what's leaving is salt. So it gets like a runner. You've seen a runner collapse because their electrolytes get low.
Right. Yes.
A bass will do the same thing under stress. It'll collapse. It'll die because it's basically peed all the salt out of its system. Is low on electrolytes. So the salt we're just putting in the water, which goes right back in through the gill, which gives its electrolytes back. And it's staggering how much better survival you get out of fish with salt. It's like a lot. Like, the studies I saw with bluegill were like, if you let the bluegill in the tank too long, like, 20% live. You add salt to the same water, 95% live.
Really?
Yeah.
So they need some Gatorade.
Just a little bit of salt will
Just
help every time.
Salt every time.
Yep. And that'll keep your fit. That'll just having a little salt in there and flushing your tank. Don't leave your cooler full of water all day. Add some new water a couple times a day and get that ammonia out and gets that fresh water in. And every time you add fresh water, add a little bit of salt to it, and you'll be fine.
That's some good tips. Now, what about caring for the cooler or the live well after a tournament? You've released a fish. Ammonia on the wall. I mean, is it something that sticks?
Just rinse it out.
Just rinse it out.
Yeah.
Nothing special you got to do.
And don't use tap water. Tap water has chlorine. It'll kill fish fast. You don't ever fill use lake water to fill your live wells up.
And why is that? I mean, what does the chlorine do?
Oh, the chlorine is just toxic to them.
Just toxic?
Yeah, it just straight up kills them. I mean, like in 10 seconds, it kills them.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
So somebody at home filling up with a water hose before, unless they're on a well,
yeah,
big no-no.
Big no-no.
Okay, Shan, I got one more question before we wrap it up. For the average fisherman,
okay,
going out to a lake such as Yahulah or really any lake, is there something that they can do, or what would you suggest they do, either big picture within the government or as an individual, or anything they do that can improve their fisheries? Any suggestions, tips like that, just from a individual standpoint, maybe even up through the ranks?
I think that's a good one. I think probably learning the biology of the bait fish that you're fishing after, that are in your lakes. For example, do you know when threadfin shad spawn?
Most don't.
Most don't. I can tell you it's at daybreak when the water temperature's probably above 60 degrees or so. They start around 60, 65, depends on the lake and where you're at. But, and they go to the edges, they go to the grass, they like the aquatic vegetation, and they like it at sunup.
That's just the way they are.
So go learn the biology of gizzard shad, of threadfin shad, of bluegill, the spawning habits. And I think that's probably the difference between what I know and what the average person knows. Is with all my shocking experience and the fact that they drilled this stuff in my head.
Right.
I have a better idea. It gives me better ideas to read that information. That's what I do. I'll go find the shock surveys that the state guys have done, look down that, and try to get, like we talked about, is it a bass heavy? Is it balanced? Are there fewer bass? Kind of prepare yourself that way to what, mentally, like I can promise you, if you're going to an impoundment that doesn't have many bass in it, you're going to need to bring your patience. Well, you're not going to get a lot of bites.
Right. You mentioned something like that to me about commerce, but the ones you get are quality.
The ones you get are quality, but you better not be mad about getting skunked 5 trips in a row.
Well, because it's going to happen.
Yeah,
right.
It's going to happen.
Well, one more question off the top of that. What about someone who has listened to this today, and they say, okay, you know what he's saying makes sense about keeping fish.
Mm-hmm.
And all his life, he's been told catch and release.
Catch and release.
He's a competitive bass angler. Mm-hmm. Catch and release. If you can't keep fish, you're destroying our fishery.
Right.
And, the book says this. The fisherman says this. What do you say to that guy that wants to take a step out and say, you know what, let's reconsider what we're doing here? Now, on the big lakes like Lanier, that might not be possible, but on these smaller reservoirs like Yahulah or a personal pond or something.
Sure.
What kind of suggestions or advice would you give that guy that wants to, let's try keeping fish?
Okay, well, I think back 50 years ago when everybody kept everything they caught, that was not a good way to manage a fishery.
Right.
Throwing back everything you catch is not a good way to manage a fishery either. The truth lies somewhere in the middle.
That makes sense.
And first thing you have to do is understand the fish population and what it needs to be removed. Okay. You don't need to be removing bass from certain situations or trout from mountain streams. I absolutely, practice catch and release there.
Right.
But in the situation where the fish do need to be harvested and it would help the fishery to do it, you have to retrain your brain. You just have to put that aside and go, all right, I've got new information, and this information is these fish have to go from this impoundment. It's not every impoundment. I'm not saying keep every bass you ever catch everywhere you ever catch it. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that if you want bigger fish, you're going to have to keep them.
Right. It's a whole new way of thinking, because that is not the way it's happening out there right now.
And I've definitely run into lakes where catch and release work great. Nobody ever, it worked out that way,
Right.
But, based on 20 years of shocking experience, I wrote a lot of management plans that said harvest bass. That was the number one problem I came across.
One of the great things about doing this with you is I cannot wait to hear the comments, possibly to read the comments about people who
are going to be mad, man. They don't like that. They'd rather shoot their dog than keep a bass.
Yeah, I'm telling you. But it was one of the things that I was looking forward to, because I knew you were thinking outside the box compared to. But it's really not outside the box. It's probably the standard way of thinking it from a biology standpoint.
Sure.
And fishermen are thinking it from more of a competitive me standpoint.
Right.
So I tell you what, I appreciate so much you coming down here, especially because I hadn't seen you in forever.
I appreciate the opportunity.
And we've already, for those listening, we've already in our minds and behind the scenes kind of planned some other stuff down the road with you, and a couple more podcasts on different subjects. But I definitely want to hear the reaction to this, and maybe, we might have to do a Facebook Live or something like that, or take the camera out to you and just say, okay, you said this. Now here's the responses, and maybe give you a little rebuttal time. I said this, they're gonna say this, and then give you another opportunity to say, well, they need to consider this. I think that would be pretty interesting.
Well, we've also got that trophy pond coming up that we're going to be working on, and we'll be doing some harvesting out of there, and we'll actually be looking at the fish in real time, from what they started at to where they finished at.
That's going to be awesome.
So
I cannot wait to see
just
all
prove
that
it.
stuff. So that'll work. But, man, I appreciate it so much.
Thank you so much, Danny.
Appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Fish North Georgia podcast. If y'all have any topics or guests you'd like to see in the future, leave it in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button, click that bell, so that you'll be notified of any future videos. And don't forget to give us a follow on Facebook and Instagram at Fish North Georgia. And we look forward to seeing you soon.